Hi, this is Andrew Novitsky from Heated, South Florida. I'm going to be doing a camera settings video today, show you how ISO, shutter speed, aperture, and all that stuff works. And I'm going to show you basically in the viewfinder of the camera while I'm taking the picture, so you'll be able to see what settings I'm changing, how they're affecting the photo. And then after that, I'm going to go into Adobe Lightroom and show you some of the pictures and show you some of the differences in more detail of how it all works. And yeah, so I'm coming from my backyard today. Sorry if there's any like wind noise. It's just raining and windy today, and some cars and whatnot, but be right back and I'll show you how this all works. Okay, so I'm back and I'm gonna show you some cool stuff here with some of these camera settings. Right now, I'm gonna just show you right here what f/22 looks like so that I can go and show you what f/28 looks like, but this is aperture that I'm explaining right now. Aperture essentially lets in more light by opening up the iris of your lens, as you can see, but everything's all, you know, bright and overexposed. Now I want to darken it. Oh man, what am I doing here? Changing the shutter speed. You can see it's doing a similar thing. It's getting brighter or darker. So as I just changed my shutter speed here and I take another picture, before I even get into ISO or whatever, you can see the difference in these two pictures. Look at that. You basically have, there you go. You can see how the f/28 image is blurry. See, the f/28 image is blurry, but then this one here is sharper and there's more stuff in the background. Now, why is that? Because aperture, as it opens up the iris in your lens and lets in more light, you're basically going to be making things, your plane of focus, what is actually sharp and in focus is going to get shorter and smaller versus shooting it like f/22. f/22, you're going to have a wider plane of focus and able to get more things like in focus and sharp, as you can see here. But depending upon what you're shooting, if you're doing portraits or if you're trying to get it more of the environment, you know, all that kind of stuff, there's going to be changing of how you use aperture. And there's more to it and everything, but as you can see, aperture not only controls the amount of light coming in either more or less, it changes how much is in focus. And you can get some of those really cool like bokeh effects and stuff that is really cool. Now, what did shutter do? Now, shutter basically is a curtain that sits in front of your lens, and it basically will control the amount of time that the sensor or the piece of film is exposed to light. So when you do that, you're basically going to have, for like say getting more light, you want to slow down your shutter, which lets in more light. And then if you want to get less light, you raise the speed of the shutter so it's faster, so you can actually take more pictures per second. But here's the problem though, is that like when you start slowing down your shutter, you start getting like, you know, motion blur and other, you know, effects, like say you have shaky hands and stuff. Oh, my dog is probably going to start howling and barking here. Anyway, you can see how it darkens and brightens the image, just like, you know, the aperture does. But as you raise the shutter or slow down your shutter and let in more light, you're going to get motion blur. So if I, for instance, go all the way to like say 1/15, then I drop my aperture down enough to get a normal exposure. Sorry about my dog there, guys. So then what happens here? Let's say I even do it even more. What happens when I start taking pictures and moving? You see that motion blur right there? That one there too? That's what happens when you have too slow of a shutter. As you get back, you can see like a couple of the pictures I took, but everything's sharp when you're not doing something like that, or you have it on a tripod. You can use slow shutters, but you gotta have it on a tripod. If not, it's not gonna work out well. But you use a slow shutter for things like light trail effects, long exposure photography, astrophotography, all that stuff when you wanna let in more light. And like I said, you know, as you basically open up your aperture, same thing, changes the light and everything, and then I gotta change my shutter speed, like, you know, speed up my shutter, because I don't want to overexpose anything. Crazy how it all works, but it's basically a balancing act. Then when you go here to ISO, ISO is essentially just the sensitivity of light that your sensor or film is. And these numbers actually are parallel to film. So if, like film back in the day, you could get ISO 800 and whatever, film all the different numbers depending upon what you were shooting. But as I change the ISO, it gets brighter and gets darker. But what you have to be aware of with your ISO is that the more you raise that number, say you're shooting at night and you raise that number, you're gonna start letting in more noise and grain, and image quality is gonna start falling. So you gotta, you know, make sure you don't push it too far. Also, sometimes you might be stuck at a shutter speed that you can't change, and same thing with an aperture because you don't have enough light. So you go to ISO and try to crank it up. Say you go past 2000 and it starts getting too crazy and noisy and it doesn't look good. You have to balance it between find the highest you can go depending upon your shooting settings and environment and everything. So all of these things affect your exposure, but they all do it in a different way. Like ISO is your sensitivity to light. Your aperture opens and closes the front element of the lens, lets in more light, lets in less light depending on the number that you use, but it also will affect sharpness and plane of focus and basically how much of your image is actually in focus. And shutter speed affects the amount of time that the shutter's open to expose the sensor to light. So essentially you got to balance out all three of these things in order to get, a nice looking image. I'll show you some other pictures here just to give you some environment, and then we're going to hop into Lightroom so I can show you some of the images and everything. Okay. So the final part of this video, I'm going to try to make it as quick as possible because I've tried doing this a couple times now and it goes to like 5 minutes, and I'm not trying to do that to the viewers. But long story short, if you really want to try to get good images in photography, it really depends. Your settings depend upon the situation and, lighting and just lighting, the lens you're using, the camera you're using. There's so many different kinds of photos and different things that you can do to get great images. Like, this one I'm shooting into the sun, so I got to stop down and I got to use a fast shutter speed of 1/1000 because I'm shooting directly into the sun. Then there's other ones like this, it's night, shooting at 1/8, 1/100 of a second ISO. The settings all depend upon what it is you're shooting and what you're trying to do. This is some astrophotography, 13 seconds, at 1/8, trying to let in as much light as possible. And with astrophotography that I didn't mention, you have a long enough shutter, you start getting star trails and the stars start to move if you do it for too long. So you got to make sure and balance something of that with your shutter and everything. There's so many things to consider. Even like this shot here, the spider web, the center's in focus, and to the left to right, everything's in focus because that's where the focal plane is. But everything behind it and in front of it is all blurred, and you get all these nice little out of focus effects and stuff. But long story short, it's all about the particular situation and the lighting and, just the different variables that go into it. And you learn a lot from trial and error and, trying to get good photos. You have to learn from experience, and you have to, practice and just see what it is you're trying to shoot. What look are you trying to go for? There's a lot of different things that go into a good photo. And sometimes the wrong settings can, turn it into a bad photo. You just got to learn. After a while, you'll see, how the lighting is and, where if you're in the shade, and you'll learn after a while, like generally at an area of what you can and can't do, the more that you, try stuff. And it's just, you'll experience things over time and, you'll learn. And I hope this video was able to teach you something. But, it's like as time goes on and you keep doing this, you'll learn, for landscapes, you're going to want to have, stop your lens down to get more things in focus so that everything is nice and sharp. But then like for portraits, sometimes you might want to shoot from like f5.6 to f1.8, depending on how much blur you want. There's times you want everything in focus, and then there's times you don't want everything in focus. Like even some of these ones I got in Georgia right here, everything's all nice and sharp and in focus and stuff. You get to see everything because I was on vacation. I want to be able to see everything. I'm not trying to blur out the background. But then, there's times where, I'm at the zoo and I want to get a nice little bit of blur behind the animal there and, get a nice little effect with the background and stuff. All depends. And then, like I said, it depends too how close you are to your subject. And it also depends too on the sensor size of your camera. If you're shooting with like a phone, it's going to look very different than something like what I was shooting on earlier today. I was shooting on a full frame camera, and I also have an APS-C camera. The larger the sensor that you have, the more like dynamic and depth and 3D effects with the look you're going to get. Whereas like phones, the smaller the sensor that you have, it's just the nature of how physics work. They're going to be more like if you stopped your lens down a lot, everything's going to be sharp and in focus. So it's like the bigger the sensor, you end up, and then the bigger the glass and the bigger the image circle, you end up changing the look of the images that you get even from that. I mean, that's a whole other story. And there's so many things I can't even go over trying to talk about all this in this video. I'm already getting almost to 4 minutes here. But, I hope that this video, taught you something and you were able to learn from it. And, it's just it's a trial and error learning experience type thing. You just keep trying and keep learning. And I hope that, I was able to give you some insight and everything. And if you have any questions, leave it down in the comments, and please like, share, and subscribe. This is Andrew Novitsky from Heated, South Florida. Hope you have a great day.